Yo, what's up? It's Driscoll. Today, guys, we're going to be looking at some tear out, and let me tell you, this is one of the heaviest drop I've made. So without further ado, let's hear it. Alright, so we're gonna go over everything in this drop, starting with the gun. I'm not gonna go over too much details about how I made it, because if you want to see that, you can always watch my previous tear out video. I'm gonna put the link in the description, but basically I followed the same process. I'm gonna show you each individual sound that made it into the final gun sound, and if you need more details, you can watch my previous tear out video. So the gun itself sounds like this at the end. And the way I made it was by using that section over there. So I started by making a sub layer real easy, just a sine wave. This is the LFO controlling the level and a little bit of pitch movement on the chorus pitch. And it sounds like this on its own. And then I made this tonal layer in Serum again. And then I resampled both of them individually. The sub bass is over here. And the tonal layer without the processing sounds like this. And then adding the whole processing chain, it sounds like this. And then on top of that, I added this percussion layer just to get more tonality in the sound. And then when you put them all together, you get something like this. And then I put it in the main section of the drop. And I added final processing. So again, if you want to see the details of this, you should watch my previous tear out video. And with the processing, this is how the gun sounds. So the first thing I want to talk about in here is, first of all, you try to have a good flow, right? And to make a good flow, my tip to you is try to make it repetitive. Make a 1 or 2 beat section, try to make it repetitive, and then you're gonna add variation. Start with something really on the grid and really simple, and then move it around and create variation throughout the drop to make it different and keep it interesting, but don't go crazy with the rhythm from the start because it's just going to be confusing for everyone when listening. The second thing I want to talk about is that when you work in audio, in Ableton you have a lot of different warp modes that you can use to make variation in the sound. And this is what I did, for example, at the end of that section here. I stretched it like 4 times, I think, and then I used the texture mode and the grain size and the flux here and just come up with this gritty sound, helping the flow going into the next section. Also, we're hearing difference in pitch. Actually, I'm not using a pitch for this. I'm using a frequency shifter, and that's my other tip. Use a frequency shifter on different section. It's really going to be making a difference rather than having a steady atonal sound. You can make it tonal using frequency shifter at certain spots in the drop. The next thing I want to talk about, and that's been really helpful for me, is to use delay, like sound delay. In Ableton, you get that from this mixer menu, and right over here at the bottom, you can put the track delay to whatever you want. I usually stay between 30 and 60 milliseconds, but this time I went even more, 84. It's just putting all the samples off grid by 84 milliseconds, basically. It just creates a really off-grid, off-time flow, and that's really helpful, especially when you're making tear out like this. If you're using FL Studio, you don't have this feature, so I recommend just going in by hand and moving the samples a little bit off the grid. So now that you have your gun, you have the flow, you have the difference in sounds, you're using frequency shifter, stretching, off-timing. The next really important section is, of course, the sub bass. So this is how my sub bass sound on its own. So the sub bass itself isn't really complicated. Again, just a sine wave, more harmonics, this pitch envelope for more attack, and this one is controlling the level. A lot of distortion, saturation, and some good EQing, a little bit of erosion here just to add some noise. The important part of that sub is the glides. I'm using the mono legato and the porta is almost halfway, a little bit more. And I find that making some glide notes, like octave notes going down at certain spots in your drop, is really helpful. So every time my gun sound is pitched up, I'm using a glide, and almost every time that it's going fast, I'm also using the higher octave in the sub bass. So for example, in this part, the gun is going triplet, and you see here that the sub is on the higher octave. Same thing over here. I feel like it's making all the difference in the world. If I had just used a steady note on the same octave, on the same note all the way through, probably sounds good, but I feel like it sounds 100 times better when you're using sub-bass movement. So now I want to talk about all the support elements that you need to complete the drop, because otherwise it's going to sound empty. This is what happened to me actually when I was making this project. I had the good drums, I had the guns, the sub bass, everything was good. It sounded cool, but at the same time it sounded empty. And a really good tip I can give you is to have in the background playing all the time a quarter note pattern, because the guns most of the time are on really off timing, they're not following a simple pattern, and having a quarter note playing all the time in the background really helps emphasizing the flow of the gun. So this is my 2 layers, and we're gonna go over the processing of these. The first one sounds like this. So I'm just using Serum, I'm using the PWM Juno wavetable and the BS2 Filthy for the FM. Both of them you can find in the analog section of Serum. I'm using some unison. D-tune is all the way down for the first one. The FM is halfway up. This LFO controls the level, and I'm using a high peak 12 filter. This is how it sounds before any processing. So first of all, some hyperdimension. I'm using the hard clip distortion. A chorus, just to make it wider, a delay on, 28 milliseconds, adding a little bit of wideness and metallic effect, then a multiband compressor, and an all-pass filter. And then going into the post-processing, I'm starting with an OTT at 15 decibels output. The time is up, the amount is down. And I'm using the grain delay from Ableton to add this very high-pitched frequencies to the sound. And then just an EQ to keep it clean. The second layer is just a hyper bass. I'm pretty sure I already showed this one in one of my previous videos. Sounds like this. 2 saw waves, a lot of unison, a lot of detune, comms filter, going into a compressor, a reverb, and EQ. And then in Ableton, I'm also adding more EQ to cut the low end really properly. And I'm also cutting the low end on the sides because the sound is really wide and I don't want it to mess with the rest of the mix. This is how they sound together. And then moving on to the growls. So for these, the idea was to not make a basic growl like very hard. I wanted to have something that sounds more like screaming. This is how it sounds. Right? It's almost like a monster screaming or something. So the way I made it, again, Serum, I'm using the Squelchy FM1 wavetable with a 16 voice unison, and detune is 100%. I'm modulating the wavetable position and the level, as well as the high notch filter, going into tube distortion and multiband compression. So without the post-processing, this is how it sounds. And then I started by adding these 2 OTTs. really biffing up the sound. A saturator with the drive up, soft clip is activated and the output is down. An EQ to clean it up. And a little bit of reverb that I'm using only for automation. As you can see here, at the end of the note, I'm adding a tell using the reverb. Also, each of these MIDI notes are being pitched up and down differently throughout the drop using the mod wheel in Serum at +12 and -12. So I think it makes it more interesting. And then under this is where I'm using a more normal growl. So it has the same pitch movement, and the way I made it was using 2 times the alien spectral wavetables, just modulating the wavetable position differently on both of them. On the second one, I'm using the bend plus minus and just controlling the level and the high notch filter. This time it's going into a downsample distortion to make it more like a yaw bass and a multiband compressor. But then the rest is pretty much the same processing. I also have reverb to have the same automation. EQ is a bit different because you need to make it fit depending on your sound. I'm still using the 2 OTTs and the saturator, and I think they go well together. And then this one is just the same growl as the first one, just a longer note. And also using a pitch automation. And then for the final section of all of this, of course you need to have a dissonant layer. I just have this sound. This is really simple. I'm using the cream wavetable, a lot of unison, a lot of detune. I'm also using a saw wave at the same time and some noise. All the levels are controlled by this LFO. And the real trick of that sound here is to have one of your wavetable, one of your oscillator to be at +1 semitone from the other. So in my case, I'm using the saw wave at +1 and the cream wavetable at 0. And this is what's making the dissonance. Going into the effects, I'm using a hyperdimension, a 0 square distortion, multiband compression, and again a low pass filter at the end. And in the post-processing is nothing crazy, just a normal EQ. And I'm also cutting the low end on the sides because that sound is really wide with all the hyper and the detune and everything. So make sure to clean it up to not mess your mix. But yeah, that's pretty much it for that section. And then on the second section, other than the flow that's different for the gun, I also changed the dissonance sound. Rather than having this one that I just explained, I have this thing playing in the background. It's not so much dissonance compared to the first one, but it's adding this high-end vibe that I wanted. This one is just a steady quarter note being pitched up all the way until the end. And the way to make it is pretty similar to the hyper bass. 2 saw waves, a lot of unison, a lot of detune. I'm using the phase 36 minus filter. This LFO is controlling all these settings, the levels, the sync, and also the coarse pitch of both oscillators. And I have once again some hyper, dimension, distortion, compression, and the post-processing is very basic, some EQ, OTT, and a little bit of reverb. And then just to finish it off, in between both drop section, I have this guitar melody playing. What's really annoying is that I spent so much time recording the guitars, like you can see all my tracks here, just to end up using this little part. I practiced the whole melody and I recorded so many times. And I tried adding it into the intro, but I think it didn't sound good. It didn't fit the rest of the song, so I ended up only using this little section here. So yeah, shit happens, but this is how it sounds. I still want to show you the whole recording though, because it sounds good. And for those of you into metal, you might recognize this. This is from Children of Bodom, one of my favorite riff. So yeah, I think that's it, guys. So once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like, comment, subscribe to the channel to not miss any of the future videos. This is Driscoll. I'll see you guys in the next one.